everyone, good afternoon. It is a good afternoon because the COVID relief package has passed the Senate. Now, when I went on my Twitter at Barb73, what I said, the first thing I said on my Twitter was, thank Black voters. Then I said, thank Latino voters. Then I said, thank Navajo voters. But then I said, thank youth voters. Because the hidden story of 2020 is the power of the youth vote. Think about this. In 2020, youth voters turned out in record numbers. But what people don't know is that 73% of all eligible African-American youth voters voted in 2020. 73%. That's more than the national turnout average. Not only that, what people don't know is that in Georgia, of the entire electorate, young voters accounted for over 40% of all the voters who turned out. When you talk about that record turnout in Georgia, young people did that, young people. And when I spoke to the young voters, and I spoke to these amazing young advocates, and I would say, why did you turn out? Guess what they would tell me? They would say, I voted for Ahmaud Arbery, the young man who was killed in Brunswick, Georgia, in Glenn County by the 3 white vigilantes who didn't like his jogging in a white neighborhood. Everybody remember Run with Mod 2.323? That's the day of his death, and those were the miles that we were trying to run in his honor. I want everybody to understand that they knew his name. Then they would say, and I voted for Rayshard Brooks, the Black man who was killed by the Atlanta Police Department. Then they would say George Floyd. Then they would say Breonna Taylor. Then they would call all of these amazing names. I want people to be very clear that these youth voters knew what they were doing. Not only that, but think about this, everybody. When we started voting in 2020, in March, voter registration went into 0 negative digits. In April, negative digits. In May, negative digits. I'm saying we weren't registering people. Voter registration was down miserably. When did voter registration go up, everybody? It went up after the George Floyd protests. People were saying all kinds of stuff that were negative and just wrong about young people not voting, young people not carrying their share. They got out there and registered like crazy. They accounted for the majority of new registrants. And people get that, twisted because we don't tell the story correctly of what really happened. But more than that, they were our backbone. Because remember, they were saying to people, a whole lot of folks who normally would have staffed the polling places couldn't do it because of their age and their susceptibility to the virus. It was young people who stepped up. But more importantly, we had to do massive voter education. The story that's missing of 2020 is all the voter education that we did. Who taught people to vote early? We did. The fact that the majority of Americans voted early goes to our credit and it was young voters who were walking those streets and knocking on those doors. People really need to understand who did the canvassing this year. It was young voters, young people. And even people who couldn't vote, they were out there at 16, really urging people to vote because our churches were closed, our civic organizations were closed, the community centers were closed. We had to have some kind of contact because a lot of our people live in internet deserts. A lot of our people were not, capable of being on the internet, didn't know how to get an absentee ballot. The fact that we were able to get millions of people who had never, ever heard of an absentee ballot, never heard of a mail-in ballot to vote is because of our push for young people to do their share and to be who they are, just great. You know that because people need to understand how powerful young voters are. And they were dominant in Georgia. They did all that canvassing. You know, we had telephone banks. When I say we, the Voter Justice Network, inspired by Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson, inspired by our leader, the amazing Darrell Jones. We have to understand that we did 562,000 postcards that we wrote and sent into Georgia. Beautiful postcards that people put on their walls. They were so gorgeous. We did over 500,000 calls into Georgia. And a lot of young people were there. You know, young people lead the way, and they were coming up with creative, TikToks and doing all kind of creative work. We had a whole youth engagement committee that was fabulous. They had their own teletown halls. They did all kinds of amazing outreach. They were registering and turning out at 18 and showing people the way. So I don't want people to get it wrong. Now, when you think about Black women's history, how does this all connect? Well, let me show you some. Think about it. Only Judge, when she escaped from George Washington's household, she was their slave, their handservant who waited on Martha Washington. When she escaped, when she found out she was going to be given as a gift to Martha Washington's daughter, and as a gift to her, when they knew that her husband, that is the granddaughter's husband, was a notorious leech. When she found out that was going to be her fate, she escaped from slavery. Martha Washington and George Washington would spend the next years, decades, begging her to come back to Mount Vernon. They would send bounty hunters, slave hunters to try to catch her, but she never was caught. And she died at a ripe old age in her 70s. And she lived a good life, and she was interviewed, and she said, honey, I know what freedom tastes like now. And you never can get me to turn back on freedom. So one lesson from her, because she was 23 when she escaped, is that young people were doing it. People talk about Harriet Tubman all the time. And we get it kind of wrong about Harriet, because Harriet was also a young woman. She was in her 20s and 30s when she was doing most of her amazing early work. She wasn't, people look at those pictures of her. She wasn't 50, y'all. She wasn't 60. She was in her 20s. And if you look at the wanted poster for her, it says that she was wanted for her escape, because they really didn't know that she was behind the Moses at that time. But what they said was that she was a beautiful woman, very pretty, petite, very smart, quick eye, gorgeous eyes. That's how they described her. And so, so much of her history has been tainted and wronged and not really spoken of well. And what we got to understand is that she had that long arc for our young people. It's one thing for us to be activists when we're young, and that's beautiful, because, I was an activist I think I started my activism at 15. But the good news is when you can be like Harriet and make it the long arc of your life, that you're able to stay in the fight, to fight for justice all the way through the season. So she was amazing. And I think people also forget, because people always talk about her in the bush and getting the, folks to come and tell them, hey, if you're not going to come with me, then you're not going anywhere else, pulling out her gun. But what people also don't know, she was the first woman to command troops in the United States. She commanded over 500 to 700 plus Black troops, Union troops at the Comanche River raid, where they freed 1,200 plus Blacks who were enslaved as those troops fought and burned down plantations and urged the people to come on their gunboats to be taken down that river. That was her leadership. She wasn't some secondary person. She was in command of the entire operation. She was a spy, a nurse, all kinds of stuff, a botanist, you name it, a geographer, everything. She was amazing. And we all want to be that kind of a woman. The third person I want to talk about really quickly, and then I'll stop, is Ida B. Wells Barnett. Because Ida B. Wells Barnett, she walked those streets of Chicago. She took on white women suffragists. And when people last year were talking about the 100th anniversary of the women getting the vote, I was like, hello, correction time. Let's get this right. It would take Black women another 45 years, even though we were at the center of that fight, even though we had our social clubs and movements and leaders. And remember, they told Ida B. Wells Barnett to walk in the back of the marches because they didn't want to upset the good white men by seeing Black women at the front. And what did Ida B. Wells do, everybody? She went to the very front of the march and she marched. But also she writes about how when she was in Chicago, one of her hardest campaigns was talking with Black men about the right of Black women to vote. And she talks about how hard that was, how threatening it was, because people were not happy with her. People told her to leave town, get out of sight, stop that talk. She talks about what it was like to stand. So one thing, that's the last lesson for young people, because also, once again, we have somebody whose activism spanned many years, a lot of in her youth. But one thing I want everybody to remember about Ida B. Wells Barnett is that not only was she persistent, not only was she brilliant, not only did she fight, the lynching and go into towns and communities where she could have been lynched herself, documenting what had happened. But one thing we always had to learn about all three of those amazing women, they were unconventional. They didn't go with whatever the conventional wisdom was. They didn't do what was called safe. They were bold women. They took amazing chances. They cared deeply about their people, and they had a love of Black people. And they had an understanding of women and the unique roles of women, and they weren't going to allow anybody to put them in a box. They broke boundaries. They broke, you talk about first, my goodness, they broke every kind of record, and they did not receive the accolades in their lifetime that they deserved. Nobody was throwing money at Harriet Tubman. She died in poverty. Nobody was throwing money at so many of our beautiful women like Zora Neale Hurston, who died in poverty. We got to be very clear that they sacrificed and that they did this work regardless of outcome, because they were about what? Justice and righteousness. So as I conclude, ultimately, my goal always is to build permanent voting rights infrastructure. I'm not about playing the party game. I don't play the electoral game. I play the voting rights infrastructure so our communities are powerful and able to, exercise their power continuously and to make the demands. And if folks don't do what we want them to do, we kick them out, right? And when they do the right thing, we applaud them and reelect them. But I just think that we have to get that powerful, and that we're making sure that our agendas are being met. So anyway, those are some of the things that I would add, to the discussion. And it's just what a pleasure, to work with young people. What a pleasure to be part of this movement. And any struggle that's been worth its salt, I just want to point out, any struggle that's ever been powerful and transformative has been intergenerational. And the problem is the old folks think they can kick the young folks out and vice versa. And we need each other in this fight. Thank you.